The Kurmi are a Hindu agricultural caste in India and Nepal. Etymology. There are several theories regarding the etymology of the term Kurmi. It may be derived from an Indian tribal language, or may be a Sanskrit compound term Krishi Karmi, agriculturalist. Another theory holds that it was derived from Krsmi, meaning ploughman. History. 18th and 19th centuries. With the waning of Mughal rule in the early 18th century, the Indian subcontinent's hinterland dwellers, many of whom were armed and nomadic, began to appear more frequently in settled areas and interact with townspeople and agriculturists. Many new rulers of the 18th century came from such nomadic backgrounds. The effect of this interaction on India's social organization lasted well into the colonial period. During much of this time, non-elite tillers and pastoralists, such as the Kurmi or Ahirs, were part of a social spectrum that blended only indistinctly into the elite landowning classes at one end, and the menial or richly polluting classes at the other. The Kurmi were famed as cultivators and market gardeners. In western and northern Awadh, for example, for much of the 18th century, the Muslim gentry offered the Kurmi highly discounted rental rates for clearing the jungle and cultivating it. Once the land had been brought stably under the plough, however, the land rent was usually raised to 30 to 80% above the going rate. Although British revenue officials later ascribed the high rent to the prejudice among the elite rural castes against tending the plough, the main reason was the greater productivity of the Kurmi, whose success lay in superior manuring, according to historian Christopher Bailey, whereas the majority of cultivators manured only the lands immediately around the village and used these lands for growing food grains. Kurmis avoided using animal dung for fuel and manured the poorer lands farther from the village. They were able, therefore, to grow valuable market crops such as potatoes, melons and tobacco immediately around the village, sow fine grains in the manjar, and restrict the poor millet subsistence crops to the periphery. A network of Ganjan Kurmi Akaki settlements could transform a local economy within a year or two. Cross-cultural influences were felt also. Hindu tillers worshipped at Muslim shrines in the small towns founded by the Muslim overlords. The Hindu Kurmis of Chana and Jaunpur, for instance, took up the Muslim custom of marrying first cousins and of burying the dead. In some regions, the Kurmis' success as tillers led to land ownership, and to avowals of high status, as noted, for examples, by Francis Buchanan in the early 19th century among the Ayodhya Kurmis of the Avadh. Earlier, in the late 18th century, when Asaf-ud-Dowlah, the fourth Nawab of Avadh, attempted to grant the Kshatriya title of Raja to a group of influential landed Ayodhya Kurmis, he was thwarted by a united opposition of Rajputs, who were themselves a group of newcomers to the court, who had been peasant soldiers only a few years before. According to historian William Pinch, Rajputs of Avadh, who along with Brahmins constituted the main beneficiaries of what historian Richard Barnett characterizes as Asaf's permissive program of social mobility, were not willing to let that mobility reach beyond certain arbitrary socio-cultural boundaries. The divergent claims to status in the 19th century illustrate the point that for non-Muslims, while Varna was generally accepted as the basis for identity, on the whole little agreement prevailed with respect to the place of the individual and the jati within a Varna hierarchy. Although the free peasant farm was the mainstay of farming in many parts of North India in the 18th century, in some regions, a combination of climatic, political, and demographic factors led to the increased dependence of peasant cultivators such as the Kurmi. In the Benares division, which had come under the revenue purview of the British East India Company in 1779, the Shalita famine of 1783 and the relentless revenue demand from the company reduced the status of many Kurmi cultivators. A British revenue agent wrote in 1790, "It unfortunately happened that during the famine aforesaid a great proportion of the Kurmis, Kachis and Koeris were in this district as well as in others supplanted by Brahmins, and bemoaned the loss of agricultural revenue in part due to this unfavorable mutation amongst the cultivators." In the first half of the 19th century, economic pressures on the large landowning classes increased noticeably. The prices of agricultural lands fell at the same time that the East India Company, after acquiring the ceded and conquered provinces in 1805, began to press landowners for more land revenue. The annexation of Avadh in 1856 created more fear and discontent among the landed elite, and may have contributed to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Economic pressures also opened marginal areas to intensive agriculture and turned the fortunes of the non-elite peasants, such as the Kurmi, who worked them. After the rebellion, the landowning classes, defeated but still pressed economically in the new British Raj, attempted to treat the tenants and labourers as people of lowly birth and to demand unpaid labour from them. According to historical anthropologist Susan Bailey, in some instances these were attempts to stave off decline by reinvigorating or intensifying existing forms of customary service. Elsewhere these were wholly novel demands, many being imposed on clean tillers and cattle keepers like the Ram and Krishna-loving Koeris, Kurmis and Ahirs. In either case, these calls were buttressed with appeals to Sanskritic Varna theory and Brahmanical caste convention. Kurmi and Ola Ahir-tillers who held tenancies from these squireens found themselves being identified as Shudras, that is, people who were mandated to serve those of the superior Kshatriya and Brahman Varnas. The elite landowning classes, such as Rajputs and Bhumihar Brahmins, now sought to present themselves as flag-bearers of the ancient Hindu tradition. At the same time, there was a proliferation of Brahmanical rituals in the daily life of the elite, a greater stress on pure bloodlines, more stringent conditions placed on matrimonial alliances, and, as noted by some social reformers of the day, an increase among the Rajputs of female infanticide, a practice that had little history among the Kurmi. The second half of the 19th century also largely overlapped with the coming of age of ethnology, interpreted then as the science of race in the study of societies the world over. Although later to be discredited, the methods of this discipline were eagerly absorbed and adopted in British India, as were those of the emerging science of anthropology, driven in part by the intellectual ferment of the discipline and in part by the political compulsions in both Britain and India. Two dominant views of caste emerged among the administrator scholars of the day. According to Susan Bailey, those like Hunter as well as the key figures of H. Risley and his protege Edgar Thurston, who were disciples of the French race theorist Topinard and his European followers, subsumed discussions of caste into theories of biologically determined race essences. The great rivals were the material or occupational theorists led by the ethnographer and folklorist William Crook, author of one of the most widely read Provincial Castes and Tribes Surveys, and such other influential scholar officials as Denzil Ibbotson and E.A.H. Blunt. Seeing caste as a fundamental force in Indian life, Risley, especially, influenced official views as expressed in both the censuses of British India and the Imperial Gazetteer brought out by Hunter. Risley is best known for the now discounted attribution of all differences in caste to varying proportions of 7 racial types which included Dravidian, quote, Aryo-Dravidian, and Indo-Aryan. The Kurmi fell into two such categories. In the Ethnological Map of India published in the 1909 Imperial Gazetteer of India and based on the 1901 census supervised by Risley, the Kurmi of the United Provinces were classified as Aryo-Dravidian, whereas the Kurmi of the Central Provinces were counted among Dravidians. In the 1901 census of India, the category of Varna, the fourfold graded system, was included in the official classification of caste, the only time this was the case. In the United Provinces, the Kurmi were classified under Class 8 castes, from whom some of the twice-born would take water and paki without question, whereas in Bihar, they were listed under Class 3 clean Sudra subclass. Quote, according to William Pinch, Risley's hierarchy was far more elaborate than that for Bihar, suggesting that contending claims of social respectability may have been more deeply entrenched in the western half of the Gangetic Plain. In the writings of the occupational theorists, the Kurmis and the Jats came to be extolled for their yeoman-like purposefulness, tirelessness, and thrift, all of which, according to writers such as Crook, Ibbotson, and Blunt, had been largely abandoned by the landed elite. Crook wrote about the Kurmi in 1897, "They are about the most industrious and hard-working agricultural tribe in the province. The industry of his wife has passed into a proverb, Bali Jat Kurman, Kapihat Kain Niro Apan Pai Kaisa. A good lot is the Kurmi woman, she takes her spud and weeds the field with her lord." According to Susan Bailey, by the mid-19th century, influential revenue specialists were reporting that they could tell the caste of a landed man by simply glancing at his crops. In the north, these observers claimed, a field of second-rate barley would belong to a Rajput Brahmin who took pride in shunning the plough and secluding his womenfolk. Such a man was to be blamed for his own decline, fecklessly mortgaging and then selling off his lands to maintain his unproductive dependence. By the same logic, a flourishing field of wheat would belong to a non-twice-born tiller, wheat being a crop requiring skill and enterprise on the part of the cultivator. These, said such commentators as Denzel Ibbotson and E.A.H. Blunt, were the qualities of the non-patrician peasant, the thrifty Jatakani Kurmi in Upper India. Similar virtues would be found among the smaller market gardening populations, these being the people known as Kioris in Hindustan. 20th century. As the economic pressures on the patrician landed groups continued through the remainder of the 19th century and into the early 20th, there were increasing demands for unpaid labor directed at the Kurmi and other non-elite cultivators. The landed elite's demands were couched in avowals of their ancient rights as twice-born landowners and of the Kurmis' alleged lowly, even servile, status which required them to serve, at times encouraged by sympathetic British officials and at other times carried by the groundswell of egalitarian sentiment being espoused then by the devotional Vaishnava movements, especially those based on Tulsidas' Ramcharitmanas. The Kurmi largely resisted these demands. The resistance, however, did not take the form of denial of caste or of caste-based imposition, but rather of disagreement about where they stood in the caste ranking. A noteworthy attribute of the resulting Kurmi Kshatriya movement was the leadership provided by educated Kurmis who were now filling the lower and middle levels of government jobs. According to William Pinch, the mantle of leadership in this phase befell the well-connected Ramdin Sinha, a government forester who had gained notoriety by resigning from his official post to protest a provincial circular of 1894 that included Kurmis as a depressed community and barred them therefore from recruitment into the police service. The governor's office was flooded with letters from an outraged Kurmi Kshatriya public and was soon obliged to rescind the allegation in an 1896 communique to the police. police department. His Honor is of the opinion that Kurmis constitute a respectable community which he would be reluctant to exclude from government service. The first Kurmi caste association had been formed in 1894 at Lucknow to protest against the police recruitment policy. This was followed by an organization in Avadh that sought to draw other communities, such as the Patidar, Marathas, Kapus and Nadis, under the umbrella of the Kurmi name. This body then campaigned for Kurmis to classify themselves as Kshatriya in the 1901 census and, in 1910, led to the formation of the All India Kurmi Kshatriya Mahasabha. Simultaneously, newly constituted farmers' unions, or Kisan Sabhas, composed of cultivators and pastoralists, many of whom were Kurmi, Ahir, and Yadav, and inspired by Hindu mendicants, such as Baba Ramchandra and Swami Sahajanand Saraswati, denounced the Brahmin and Rajput landlords as ineffective and the morality as false. In the rural Ganges Valley of Bihar and eastern United Provinces, the Bhakti cults of Rama, the incorruptible Kshatriya god king of Hindu tradition, and Krishna, the divine Kshatriya guardian of cows, had long been entrenched among the Kurmi and Ahir. The leaders of the Kisan Sabhas urged the Kurmi and Ahir followers to lay claim to the Kshatriya mantle, promoting what was advertised as soldierly manliness. The Kisan Sabhas agitated for the entry of non-elite farmers into the British Indian Army during World War I. They formed cow protection societies. They asked the members to wear the sacred thread of the twice-born, and, in contrast to the Kurmis' own traditions, to sequester the women in the manner of Rajputs and Brahmins. In 1930, the Kurmis of Bihar joined with the Yadav and Koheri agriculturalists to enter local elections. They lost badly, but in 1934 the three communities formed the Triveny Sangh political party, which allegedly had 1 million dues-paying members by 1936. However, the organization was hobbled by competition from the Congress-backed Backward Class Federation, which was formed around the same time, and by co-option of community leaders by the Congress Party. The Triveny Sangh suffered badly in the 1937 elections, although it did win in some areas. The organization also suffered from caste rivalries, notably the superior organizational ability of the higher castes who posed it, as well as the inability of the Yadavs to renounce the belief that they were natural leaders and that the Kurmi were somehow inferior. Similar problems beset a later planned caste union, the Rag of Samash, with the Koheris. Again in the 1970s, the India Kurmi Kshatriya Sabha attempted to bring the Koheris under the wing, but again a disunity troubled this alliance. Kurmi politician Nitish Kumar formed the Samata Party in 1994, forming a backward upper caste alliance with the conservative Bharatiya Janata Party, which achieved early initial success. In 1998, politician Lalu Prasad Yadav took advantage of this lack of unity in the IKKS, portraying Koheri Shakuni Chowdhury as an incarnation of Kush. Under Yadav, the IKKS became less and less advantageous to the Kurmi, favoring instead the priorities of the Yadav caste, and this combined with the competition of the Kurmi-based Samata led to a divide between these intermittently allied castes.